So here we are, back again, and on a glorious and exceptionally hot Pittsburgh day. It's supposed to be 100 in, I feel like 100 out there. It certainly feels like 100 in here. Has anybody joined us yet, or is everybody out sunning themselves? Hello, who's ever out there? And in case you're wondering, it is Elizabethan music. I always feel very sorry for people who lived prior to Bach, because Bach changed everything with regard to music. Hello, Jim. Everything happened from Bach. So prior to Bach, well, you had, some very strange noise. That was the correct word for it, noise. There is actually a singing ensemble in the UK called the King's Noise, which I think is rather charming. I had an album of them, but I think somebody borrowed it. That's the way it always goes with my stuff. It's not the most exciting music to listen to. I think the religious music of the period was slightly more exciting. Hello, Eileen. All the way over in Shadyside. And Mary Lou and Barry in Shadyside too. Shadyside's coming in strong on an early run. So yes, Elizabethan music. It's not the secular music is not as exciting as the church music was. But then the church music was full of portent and heaviness and the notion of suffering. Suffering is a big thing in religion. I never understood why. I think, again, it's because we use the word in a different sense. Betty in Columbus, Ohio. I played Columbus, Ohio just the once, Waiting for Godot on tour. Very pleasant. We found a wonderful bar there called The Elevator. Probably gone now, but that was great. Hello, Robert in Florida. I hope you're being very careful in Florida. You seem to be the epicenter at the moment. Of all things, New York City seems to be one of the safest places, and Florida seems to be the least. Who would ever have thought that? But there you go. Hello, Ginny in Regent Square. Sure, you're a neighbor. How lovely. You see, far-flung places like Regent Square, Florida, the Netherlands, we get them from everywhere. Cannonsburg. Hello, Joan. Now we have a vocal number now. The high tenor and the falsetto singers, and probably the castrati, were always very popular then as well. I think it's to do with the fact that just as women weren't allowed to act, I don't think they were allowed to sing either. So if you wanted that voice, that's where the castrati came from, that, you would use these very high tenor voices. But something really rather haunting about it that I find attractive. Arthur, on your wife's computer, I hope she knows that you're fiddling with her computer. Hello, Grace. They're in Dublin. It's a very, very hot afternoon here in Pittsburgh. I was saying earlier, I think it's 100 in the shade, or 100 feels like. I think it's about 93, 94, but it feels like 100, which is, I think that's 37 degrees in European reading. Pretty hot. People are thundering in, which is great. You're better off here listening and looking at me and joining in, because you could be out there in the blazing sun, or you could be out there in the pouring rain, depending on what part of the world you're in, or you could be out there in the moonlight. Much better off that you're indoors with me. You'll feel happier at the end of the day. A lot of people signed up for this series. I'm really delighted because it is my pet topic, and one of my pet topics, but I do tend to talk about everything. But I think the whole idea of this one is to make people think again about Shakespeare, especially people who, for some reason, think they don't like it. And so I'm hoping there are people out there who think they don't like it, who we may be able to change the minds of. And if my voice sounds funny, it's because I've got an ear problem at the moment, so I can only hear that side of me. If my voice suddenly keeps changing volume, it's because I can't hear myself. Life is very complex. That Kel or Ken in Birmingham, Alabama, I'm so glad you look forward to the lectures. I look forward to giving them. It's a nice roundup to the week with all the various things you have to do to actually just sit down and chat about theatre, which is, what I really love doing. Now, Jill, there's the point. Not so much don't like or can't understand the language. That's what we're going to try and address. Because it's much more simple than you think if you just put a little thought into it. It's like cooking. Everybody says, oh, I can't cook. And then you give them a recipe and they follow it. And then they realize they can cook. Well, it's the same with Shakespeare in that sense. But I'll be talking about that in a second. Hello, Valerie, who's in Montreal, QC this month. Just this month? Actually, you could be in worse places. Hello, James. And John in Toronto. I like Toronto. Friendly. And the beginning of the longest street in the world. Not many people know that. Hello, Nicola from Cork. I think what you mean to write there, Nicola from Cork, is looking forward to hearing about the bard. Little tiny typo there that made it very interesting. There you are, John. Yonge Street stretches from Lake Ontario to Minnesota. It's pretty long. I think it is technically the longest street in the world. Peggy, me too, and for about the same period, if not a little bit longer. I think you got another typo there, Nicola. You made it. Bard, well done. So hello to everybody. It's just gone 2 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start on today's talk. Now, this is the beginning of 5 talks, and they're all about Shakespeare, and I've divided it into particular topics. This week, we're just going to talk about the language. I call it speaking Shakespeare, but it's as much about reading Shakespeare as speaking Shakespeare. And sorry, I just have to turn off the machine there with the music. So one of the things I think, by the way, the other programs later on, next week, we're going to look at Shakespeare's ladies. I mean, terribly, terribly gentlemanly there, Shakespeare's women. And what makes Shakespeare's women so interesting is that those parts were written not for women, but for boys and young men. And yet he wrote some of the most remarkable roles for women in all of dramatic literature. Then we are going to have a look at Shakespeare's heroes, not only the men, Shakespeare's villains, not only the men, and then in the final of the 5, we're going to actually examine the way he structured a play, and we're going to be using probably his most popular play, certainly in the top 3, and that is Macbeth. Anyway, that's for future weeks. Today, we're going to look at speaking Shakespeare, or the language. Now, people always say that the problem they have with Shakespeare is they find it difficult to understand. And there's a reason for that. It's Elizabethan English. So it was written 400 years ago. Now, I have no doubt that if people were to read what you write today, 400 years from now, they would have some difficulty with it. But the other thing I'm certain of is that a vast number of the words you use today will still be being used 400 years from now. They may have somewhat changed their meaning, but they'll still be used. And I'll give you an example of that. Within Shakespeare's, the words that Shakespeare uses, he uses, there's a line that King Lear has when he wakes up and apologizes to Cordelia. I am a very foolish, fond old man. Fond then meant silly, not attracted by or what have you. The term silly was rather a very insulting word, you silly. Naughty was a really rude thing to say. So words do change their meaning and change their, but fundamentally, the language that we use today is still the language of Shakespeare. But people are afraid of the words and sometimes the way that they are written. You open the book and it's the shock of all that poetry, the way it actually appears on the page. And in fact, if you get a complete works of Shakespeare, I have one here somewhere. No, here we go. This is why I do it in front of my bookshelves. But if you look at a complete works of Shakespeare, you open it up, and it sort of looks suspiciously like the Bible. There's possibly a reason for that. Trying to get all those plays into a relatively small volume, you want to cramp it all together. But the way that it's formulated on the page, because of the verse, because of the internal structure of the writing, it does tend to look a little bit like the Bible. And actually, for what we do know, Shakespeare might have even had a hand in that, because one of the theories is, and if you look at the word structures and all of that, he probably was one of the composers of the King James Version, because when King James ordered the new version of the Bible, they got every decent poet and writer in the country to work together as groups to actually decide on the language structure. Oscar Wilde condemned, as he said, to speak the language of Shakespeare and the Bible. So if you can read the James Bible, you can read Shakespeare. And an awful lot of people who will go to church now will quote quite happily from the James Version, the King James Version of the Bible, as if it was normal speech for them. And yet they'll say, oh, but I can't understand Shakespeare. It's the same language. But it just feels like it's not the language we speak, and it's not the language we understand, and yet there it is. The first problem with understanding it, coming to terms with it, is that his works are not novels. They are plays. They are drama. They are words that were written to be heard rather than read in silence. And when you can read a book quietly to yourself without ever opening your mouth except to take a small sip of wine, that's lovely. But when you read a play, it is not to be read that way. That's not the way it was written. It was read to be heard, to be watched. So the first thing that I say to people, if you're going to start, if you want to conquer this problem, read it aloud. And I will explain a little bit on how you do that. Because again, people go, I can't read, I can't act, I can't read Shakespeare aloud. I wouldn't understand. Yes, you will. We'll help you a little bit. First, let's look at the words. We speak Shakespeare all the time. We're using Shakespearean phrases all the time. Shakespeare invented words that we use today. I mean, one of the famous ones is that he invented, or pretty much invented, the un-word. What do I mean by that? You are without truth. You are untruthful. There is no kindness in you. You are unkind. I have no certain sense of this. I am uncertain. Shakespeare used this. Now, he to a large extent created it because it made it more convenient in terms of the structure of his lines and the simplicity and the purity of the line that he was trying to write. So by using the unword and making it, I mean, I don't think he invented it. What I think is he perfected it. Nobody can ever say that somebody invented a language trait. But I think that where it might have been possibly around, maybe he did invent it, but maybe it was around, he actually perfected it and used it wonderfully. Because it allows words, you get the capacity within unwords of excessive or extra emphasis. For instance, most of you who've studied grammar at school in those dear, wonderful bygone days when we actually did study grammar and cursive writing, was the notion that you can't have a double superlative. In other words, something is something, you can't qualify it. And he has a line in Julius Caesar when Mark Antony is doing the famous oration over the body of Caesar, and he points at the wound that Brutus made with the glorious line that is a double superlative. This was the most unkindest cut of all. Now, of course, you should say this was the most unkind cut, or this was the unkindest, but you can't have most unkindest because you're qualifying a superlative. Shakespeare does it, and he uses his own language and he uses our language in a way that creates emphasis and a purity. You've got to look for these simple phrases and realize what he's doing, because he's feeding your imagination with words all the time. That's the double superlative. You use Shakespeare's words all the time. I'll give you an example. The be all and the end all. In a nutshell, eat me out of house and home. As good luck would have it, bated breath, brave new world, crack of doom, fancy free, foregone conclusion, wild goose chase, green-eyed monster, milk of human kindness, pure as the driven snow, forever and a day, cruel to be kind, love is blind. It's enough to set my teeth on edge, another of the bards, and on and on and on. Even knock knock, who's there, is from the play Macbeth. Everything that pretty much anything that you care to say or use as a useful adage or phrase comes from Shakespeare, because he had this wonderful capacity to crystallize a thought and to put it into a phrase that sticks in the head. That you probably, I doubt whether any of you have failed to use at least one of those phrases at some point in your life. So it's an understanding of how words work and the way they work and what Shakespeare did with them. Okay, so we know that he invented some words. We know that he constructed phrases that were so perfect in their description of a moment or an attitude or a thought that they stay with you and that you use them in your everyday speech. We do more than that. We do more with Shakespearean speech than just use his phrases. He helped, I suppose you could say, to define the way that English is now spoken. Prior to Shakespeare, prior to the Elizabethans, and he wasn't alone. I mean, there was a whole clatter of writers at that period. The Golden Age, the Elizabethan and early Jacobean period, was producing wonderful writing. I mean, there was Marlowe, there was Bacon, and later on there was Webster, and there were various others. But Shakespeare seemed to do it better. Now, I don't want to get into the, well, it was actually Marlowe who wrote Shakespeare or any of that nonsense. I don't care. I don't care if it was William Shakespeare of Stratford or not. But the person who wrote those plays, which for the sake of argument we'll call Shakespeare because all the evidence points in that direction, was a genius of words. And I'll come to the parallels of that word genius a little later on. I hope you're taking notes because I want some questions afterwards. Anyway, but this brilliant way of crystallizing thoughts into precise phrases, no other writer of that period, and very few writers since, have had that. I'll use the word genius again in its very pure sense, the genius of thought crystallization into simple but perfect phrases. After all, probably one of the most famous lines he wrote, the most fundamental question regarding life, which he summed up in the purest and simplest of phrases that we all know: to be or not to be. You can't get it more simple than that. Will I or won't I go on? In fact, Beckett sort of followed that thought. Then the next thing that we have is the use of verse. Why? Why does he write in verse? Well, he doesn't always. A large portion of his plays are written in prose. In fact, the earlier plays like Titus Andronicus, there's an awful lot of prose. Some plays have more prose, some plays have less. Some plays have more verse, some plays have less. But what is the nature and the reason behind Shakespearean verse and prose? So, when you look at a play by Shakespeare and you see all this verse, your first thought is to think poetry. Writing in verse is not writing poems. Writing in prose and verse can be, and in Shakespeare's sense, usually is, poetic. So you can't think of them as poems. If you do, you're gonna lose the whole point of the verse and what the verse does. So let's look at the kind of verse that he writes. And there are two principles. One is rhyming verse and the other is blank verse. Rhyming verse explains itself. Blank verse is verse that doesn't necessarily rhyme. And he uses these forms in very specific ways to create very, very specific effects. Using verse can be a wonderful way. It's rather like using music, depending on the key signature, whether you're in a minor key or a major key or whatever, changes the tonality of the music. And using verse can change the tonality of the words. So let's begin with it. What about these verses? First of all, let's talk about the rhythm of the verse, which, to give it its technical term, is the meter. More musical, but I prefer to use rhythm because we speak and move in rhythm. We're actors, and rhythm is part of our modus operandi, that we move with rhythm, we speak with rhythm, we choose those rhythms, and when you're dealing with Shakespeare, he's helping you by providing you with those rhythms. So rhythm or meter in Shakespeare is all about where you put the stress on words. Get that wrong and it will make no sense. I'll give you an example. What do I mean by putting the emphasis in the right place? Well, if I were to say, to put the wrong emphasis on the incorrect syllable, it makes no sense. To put the wrong emphasis on the incorrect syllable does make sense. Where you put the emphasis guides what the line means and how the person who you're talking to perceives what the line is. You don't say to be or not to be. To be or not to be makes no sense. The words are in the correct order, but it is about the rhythm and the emphasis. You've got to get your emphasis correct and not on the wrong syllable. To be or not to be. Now, in verse, we have a thing called a foot, which is a technical term for a linked strong and weak stress. And the principal one that he uses is this very simple didum. Didum, which is very often how we speak. Didum, especially in English. Didum, to be, or not to be. Didum, 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 to be or not to be. It's that simple, fundamental rhythm, and that's the way we speak most of the time. And that's the way we speak most of the time. Didum, 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 didum. So in other words, this particular meter is naturally spoken English. How many of these feet you put into the line defines the time of the verse you're using. And now we have this strange thing, an iamb, which is a measure didum. That's an iamb. Iambic verse is based on that rhythm, didum. So Iambic Pentameter, which is the verse that most of the time Shakespeare is using, pentameter 5, pentagram, pent 5. So you get 5 beats on a line, or 5, well, you get 5, it's a double beat because there are 10 syllables linked together, didum, 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 didum. That's an iambic pentameter, 5 iambic feet. It sounds terrible when you say it technically, but the reality is it's just didum, 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 5, that's it. Didum 5 times, you've got a line of Shakespeare. Example, 2 households, both alike in dignity. The course of true love never did run smooth. Sometimes you get a female ending. A female ending is where you get an extra D on the end of the line. To be or not to be, that is the question. That's called a female ending because it's soft. Anyway, if you read these lines aloud, knowing that you're just reading normal rhythmic speech, didum, 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 to be or not to be, that is the question. The two households, both alike in dignity. The course of true love never did run smooth. You say this all the time. You can read it with such ease if you just let yourself speak English. Now, there's another rhythm, which is, I've heard it described with both, and I can never remember which one it is because I'm now very old. Troche or troche, T-R-O-C-H-E. Now, in that, the opposite of what I've just told you is true. Instead of didum, we get didum. Didum, not didum. The emphasis is deliberately reversed, and it gives it a more sing-song sound. It gives it a more doggerel-y. It's like, I'll give you an example. And it's usually done with 4 feet rather than 5. So you've got didum, 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 you've got didum, 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 didum. For example, double, double, toil and trouble. Didum, 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 didum. That's the rhythm. Why that rhythm? Or by the pricking of my thumbs. Why that rhythm? It kind of, I suppose what one might say is it makes it more like a chant. it makes it more like, and for instance, those two lines I've just quoted came from the witches in Macbeth. But when you get that rhythm, it becomes more of a chant. There's something slightly sing-song about it. And whenever you watch those scary movies about witches and things, they're always doing chants and things, and I guarantee they're always using that particular rhythm. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. It's the rhythm of the police siren. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. It bangs into your brain. It's very interesting. I never thought about that. That thought just came into my brain as I was saying it, but it is that rhythm. Dee-da, 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 and it's very compulsive. Double, double, toil and trouble. By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. It beats into you. Do you see what I'm talking about? Read it aloud and you get it. It's so easy. So why iambic? Why the 5 feet to the line? Why do that? Why did these Elizabethan writers select this and perfect it? Because I believe, and I'm not alone, it's the natural rhythm of spoken English. That's the way we unconsciously speak all the time. And it's actually the easiest way to write a conversation. I used to do this years ago with students back in Dublin. And you can try this at home. It's perfectly safe. There's no danger. All you're doing is playing with words. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Now, let me just say, it's really great each Friday being here with you. There's nowhere else I would rather be. Though, given as a choice, I strongly do suspect I'd rather be on my deck with a beer. I've just spoken Iambic Pentameter. It's really great each Friday being with you. There's nowhere else that I would rather be. Though given a choice, I strongly do suspect I would be on my deck and with a beer. 4 lines of Iambic Pentameter that are just normal conversation. And we do it all the time. And if I were to sneak up behind you and record your conversations, which of course I would never do, but if I were to do that, I guarantee that something like 60% of the time you're actually speaking pentameter. It's the way we use English. It's English as it comes out of the brain. It's English as it comes out of the brain. Didum, 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 didum. I'm just making this up as I go along here. So why use pentameter? Because it's the way we speak. It's the way we understand. Why use the didum, didum? Why use that particular foot, that iambic? Because that's the way we speak the language. That's because that is the way we speak the language. Didum, 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 didum. It's normal. It's comforting. It's easy on the ear. If we want to shock, dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. And we are just 2 very simple reactions, fundamental reactions. And it's done simply where emphasis goes on a line, where emphasis goes on a thought, where emphasis goes on a phrase. Now, in his plays, Shakespeare uses rhyme a lot as well. And this is where it goes beyond the realm of normal speech, because most of us don't speak in rhyme. And when we do, we'll sort of go, oh my God, I just made a poem. We get surprised by the fact we've rhymed. Rhyme is a natural thing in the brain. The brain responds quite well to the idea of rhyme. That's why some people still insist that if a poem doesn't rhyme, it's not a poem. Well, that's not true. But rhyme is one of those mechanisms that we use to impress upon ourselves a moment, a meaning, a feeling, a sense, an emotion, whatever. So Shakespeare uses rhyme quite a lot. He will use particularly rhyming couplets, sometimes with really direct rhymes, which gives a precise emphasis to what's being said. For instance, he'll have a whole scene, massive amounts of things have happened in it, and at the very end of the scene, he'll finish it with a rhyming couplet. And it's a bit like sort of doing a little signature at the end or a little moment at the end to say, well, that's that. Now we'll move on. It's like an end note. You know those things when you're listening to a piece of music. I mean, actually, it was on the radio the other day. I was out listening, and Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. And if you've ever listened to it, it's not his greatest achievement. He hated it himself. But that end, da 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 da, and he goes on and on and on. But he has this wonderful moment at the end to say, "It's all right, it's finished." And that's, I think, what the rhyming couplet at the end of a scene sort of does. It adds a little grace note to the end. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Romeo and Juliet. I'm going to use a few quotes from Romeo and Juliet. After he's had his moment in the garden with the balcony and got her to agree that she'll marry him and that they can do whatever they do. You know what young teenagers are like. They're terrible people. The whole scene is over. You've listened to this beautiful scene of vowels of love and all of that. And now he's got to do something about it. And so he does it with a rhyming couplet. Now will I to my ghostly friar's close cell his help to crave and my dear hap to tell. And in that couplet, you now have it, it's like the transition scene. You've come to the end of a scene and Shakespeare is saying, now, what's going to happen next? Well, he's going to tell you. Now will I to my ghostly friar's, but ghostly meaning holy, friar's close cell, his help to crave and my dear hap to tell, those wonderful things that have happened to me. But brought down to this perfect little couplet that is telling you where we're going next. Saying we've had that scene, you know what happened, now on we go. And he uses a rhyming couplet, and it's a kind of a grace note. It's a sort of a signature. It's a way of saying, okay, ready to move on, here we go. He's using verse as a mechanism. Now, sometimes that was a simple rhyme, rhyming cell with tell. Sometimes with the rhymes, he'll use the A-B format, which will give more lyricism, a bit like a song. Back to Romeo and Juliet again, when they first meet. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this. My lips to blushing pilgrims ready stand, to smooth the rough touch with a tender kiss. Hand this, stand, kiss. So he's using that A-B formula, which we know from songs. He's using it in a very lyrical way, and he wants you to read the lyricism into the lines. This is a young man who's been moping around in love with somebody that he's never actually had a conversation with and who doesn't want to know him. And suddenly he sees this gorgeous young girl in a party, and he is so smitten by her in that moment. I mean, the line that Shakespeare uses when he first sees Juliet, what does Romeo say? Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. Oh my God. Ladies, wouldn't you love to have somebody like say that about you? I mean, I would love somebody to say that about me. But that notion, that notion of being hit, what was the thing in The Godfather? The thunderbolt. You see this person and bang, you know this is it. And so the way that Shakespeare wants you to understand that is by using this lyrical form, the A-B form of rhyme. It actually goes on to something even more special I'll come to in a second. But that's the use of the couplets in terms of the A-B form. Sometimes he will use it between two voices to show how two people are having an argument or a debate, but then their thoughts are so completely, they're almost finishing each other's sentences. Now, you do that all the time. We all do that. We always finish one. It's the most annoying thing that husbands and wives do to one another is finish each other's sentences. And especially at dinner parties when there are other people in the room. So, or the dead giveaway is that the husband finishes the sentences of somebody else. But it's that attunement of the mind, the attunement of the brain to the debate, to the argument, and to each other. Romeo and the Friar, for instance, when he's gone to tell the friar about Juliet, and the friar's going on about, well, what about Rosaline that you used to like? And the exchange goes, thou chidest me oft for loving Rosaline, for doting, not for loving pupil mine, and badest me bury love, not in a grave, to lay one in the other out to have. Now there you see a line, a 5-beat line, split between the two speakers. One is finishing or taking the thought before the thought is complete and jumping in with another thought. And that tells you that these two people are actually, they're close. This is a young man and his confessor. This is a young man and his teacher. This is a young man and his, I suppose you might say, spiritual and emotional father, and that they can finish each other's sentences. And Shakespeare tells us that simply by making them share the lines. He does it again, Romeo with his close friend, Mercutio, where they play the same game of finishing, using verse to finish each other's line. You have this wonderful moment just before the party where he's going to meet Juliet. And Romeo doesn't want to go and doesn't want to dance and doesn't want to do everything, and says to Mercutio, I dreamt a dream tonight. And Mercutio says, and so did I, completing the 5. I dreamt a dream tonight, and so did I. Well, what was yours, says Romeo, that dreamers often lie, completing the 5. Well, what was yours that dreamers often lie? Then we get the couplet. In bed asleep when they do dream things true, Mercutio, oh, then I see Queen Mab hath been with you, which is the end. The ending with the couplet is saying that thing is over because we're now going to go into one of the most magnificent speeches that Shakespeare ever wrote, the Queen Mab speech. But to introduce it, to get us to that point, Shakespeare gets these lines shared so that you know these two are bonded. You know these two are so used to one another, they can talk, they can finish each other's lines, they can finish each other's thoughts. And he uses the verse structure, the iambic structure, to make that work, to demonstrate that to you. Then, sorry, I need coffee. You have to bear with me, I'm getting old. Then there is the sonnet. The sonnet form, I think, I think the sonnet is the most perfect and beautiful of all poetic forms. Now, I'm a minimalist by nature. I love that reduction, that you're making the perfect sauce, and no matter how many ingredients you put into it, you reduce it and you reduce it and reduce it until it's got its own specific, perfect, simple richness. And to my mind, that's what the sonnet is. It's the most beautiful form. And when you think of it in musical terms, I mean, if I was talking about Bach earlier, Bach wrote some phenomenal music, choral music and everything else. But if you want the perfect definition, the perfect distillation, Bach's cello suites are it. They are the purest of minimalist complexity, but I mean it. They are the summation of the perfect phrase of music and how you play with it and how it travels through the imagination. Chopin's nocturnes, most of them phenomenally simple, not terribly long, but perfect tone poems in that sense. And Shakespeare's sonnets, all of those. There is hardly one of them that isn't, in its own way, gently perfect. What is a sonnet? Okay. It's a poem. 14 lines of verse with the A-B rhythm, but it finishes the last two. The A-B is only there for 12 lines. The final 2 lines are a rhyming couplet. For instance, and I shall read you a sonnet now because I know you're all out there saying, oh, read us a sonnet, Alan. So I'm going to read you Sonnet 18, but I'm not going to read it pretty. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Now, I immediately did something there. Not, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That's the iambic footage, if you like. But one has variety within it because it is not absolute. It is the general drift of the line. You can say that. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Or to something else? No. But also, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? There is a wonderfully liquid flow to that line. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Look at the way the rhythm is working there, bringing you forward. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. The and lifts it. It almost like musically lifts it a tone. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. I love that phrase. BBC did a whole TV series called The Darling Buds of May. Beautiful. It's the darling buds of May. What a perfect phrase. As I was saying, he sort of perfects a thought in the simplicity of a phrase. It's not just the buds of May. It's the darling buds of May. And they're darling because we've been waiting for them. And when they would come, we are so overjoyed because the spring is here. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So we've got day, May, temperate date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. Sometimes you see the sunshine, sometimes it's cloudy. Much better way to say it though, isn't it? Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. By chance or nature's changing course, and every fair from fair sometime, I'm jumping ahead of myself, and every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. No matter how pretty you are, not going to last. From every fair from fair sometimes declines. Not sometimes, sometime. At some point, it's all going to go. Gravity will take over. By chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. He's such a charmer. You're not going to get over me. Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. We're going into new rhymes here. Nor shall death brag thou wondrest, nor shall death brag thou wondrest in his shade. Shade. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. Growest. And then the couplet. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So you've got this wonderful poetic form, the sonnet, which is singing the praises, but not just the praises and the beauty of one he loves, but the eternalness of that beauty, because in the end, he is saying that the when in eternal lines to time thou growest won't make any difference. I will still think you are wonderful, beautiful. You are the perfect summer's day that will never cease. Now that's a glorious sonnet, and it's so simple. It's about one thing. You're beautiful. You're just like a summer's day. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear. You know. You see where that's going. Now sometimes, she wrote an awful lot of sonnets. Some of them are exquisite. Some of them are really funny. Some of them are very self-deprecating. Some of them are very sad. My favorite one, because I always imagine Shakespeare sitting in the Mermaid Tavern and looking at all these young poets writing sonnets, really sort of sicky, icky ones. And Shakespeare wrote what is known as Sonnet 130. I'm not going to do the whole thing. Look it up. Sonnet 130. Brilliant. My mistress eye is nothing like the sun. And what he is saying in that one is, she's not this. She's not. I mean, I swear I never saw a goddess go, my mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. in some music there is more delight, or in something there's more delight in the breath that from my mistress reeks. You know, he is saying, I don't love her because it's phony, not false comparison. I love her because she is what she is, and that's what I love. So you can have this wonderful summer's day illusion. You can have Shakespeare talking about the realities of human relationship, but he does it each time through this perfect minimalist sonnet form that is so beautiful, but he does it in the plays as well. He will create a pure sonnet. Why will he use the sonnet form? In dialogue between two characters. He does it to show that there is a bond or a developing bond. And probably the most famous example is actually in Romeo and Juliet. Romeo meets Juliet, we've already looked at that. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this. My lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. Oh, such a charmer. She replies, because she's smart. Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. And what she's saying to him is, get your hands off me, put them together and pray. But you've just had the first 8 lines of a sonnet. The next 4, which will be the 12 of the A-B form, are between the two of them. Romeo responds, have not saints lips and holy palmers too? Juliet, I, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. Oh, then, dear saint, oh, he's so clever here. Oh, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray. Let us put our lips together as we might put our hands together, because by putting our lips together, we are in fact praying. Juliet, who is even smarter than him, it's a classic case of, I see what you did there. And her response is quite brilliant. But we've already there done 12 lines of a sonnet with the A-B format, the rhyme on the second line. But now we bring the two of them together with a rhyming couplet that actually concludes that moment and allows us to move on to the next. Juliet says, saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake. Saints in a church are statues. They don't go anywhere. If you want to kiss the saint in the statue, it's not going to move. To which Romeo then says, then move not, while my prayer's effect I take. Sake, take. You led to that. What's the next thing he does? He kisses her. That sonnet has brought the two of them perfectly together in 14 lines. But it's not any 14 lines. It's 14 lines distilled with a kind of a purity to it, a purity of intention, perfectly explained. Read it aloud and you'll get it. Don't try to read it on the page because it's not a book. It's a play. It's people talking. And if you read it aloud and you follow those very simple rules of rhythm, suddenly the whole thing becomes incredibly clear. I hope everybody can understand that. So there you are. That's the verse side of things. There is also the use of prose. Now, there are a multitude of examples of the many reasons why he uses prose. Now, in his earlier plays, he used a lot more. And I think Titus Andronicus, is the one with the most use of prose in it. But well, suffice it to say, he uses prose when verse would be too structural or too formal, or when the characters themselves become prosaic. When, say, letters are read, or when he wants to contrast the nature of characters, sometimes he'll mix verse and prose together. His prose is nevertheless hugely poetic, and you will usually find a hidden rhythm within that prose. But this idea of mixing the nature of characters by use of prose and verse being literally within the same conversation. For instance, if you look at As You Like It as an example, you have rustic characters and noble characters. You'd imagine that the noble characters would speak all the verse and the rustic characters would speak all the prose. No, quite the opposite. In fact, Silvius the shepherd speaks some wonderful verse. Rosalind, when she is the lady of court, speaks in verse, but when she's in disguise as the boy Ganymede, she uses prose. And when she converts back again, she goes into verse. So what Shakespeare is doing is saying, listen to the sounds, listen to the rhythms. It's telling you what I want you to understand about the nature, not just of the character, but of the scene that they're in, of the conversation that they're having. In Romeo and Juliet, which is a play with some of his very finest verse, there's a wonderful morning after the ball scene, you know, when they're out on the street and Mercutio is badly hungover and so is Benvolio, and they're waiting for Romeo and they don't know where he is. And then Romeo turns up, and then the nurse turns up, and Benvolio and Mercutio particularly absolutely ridicule both Romeo and the nurse, and it's entirely in prose. No verse. Until Mercutio and Benvolio leave, and Romeo and the nurse are left alone at the end to plan the marriage. And it jumps immediately into verse. That final exchange between the two of them is in verse until Romeo leaves, and then there's 3 lines left over where the nurse is just with her servant Peter, and it jumps back into prose again. Excuse me. So what Shakespeare is doing is he's guiding the way you look at this. He's guiding the way you examine it, the way you understand what the characters are going through. You know, Mercutio is very hungover. By the way they speak, by the rhythms of speech. And prose is just a non-rhythmic, in that sense, a non-poetic rhythmic way of speaking. There are still rhythms within it, but it's not formulated as a verse structure. Verse is verse is verse. And we've explained the two particular forms that he uses. When we follow the next scene, and the nurse arrives, you know, Juliet's been waiting for the nurse, you know, it was 9 o'clock when I did send the nurse. Now is the sun upon the highmost hill of this day's journey. In other words, it's noon. All in verse. The nurse arrives, and it's really interesting to read that little scene because you'll notice that the nurse jumps from verse to prose, from verse to prose. When she's telling the news of the wedding, she's in verse. When she's complaining about her aching back and her sore feet and all the rest of it, she jumps into prose. And Shakespeare is again guiding the way the words are spoken, guiding the logic behind it. If you read it aloud, you'll feel it, you'll get it. So the moral of that really is that you need to look at how Shakespeare is writing the words to see what he wants you to understand from them. And if you use those simple guidelines of what is if it's verse, which rhythm is it? Is it dee-dum, 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 or is it dee-dum, 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 dee-dum? You know, think of it, nice flowing rhythm, or here comes the ambulance. And you suddenly get it. It becomes simpler to understand. Or is he using prose? And if he's using prose, is he mixing it with verse? And who is speaking the verse and why? Once you've gone through it a couple of times, suddenly the thing becomes so easy, so simple. It's, you know, it's like following a recipe for, you know, a new dish. You need to do it a couple of times following it. But once you've done that, you get a sense of it, the whole thing seems to open up. Don't be afraid of the words. Now, there is another point here. Shakespeare, I like to think of Shakespeare as the first true director, because he is using those rhythms to tell the actor which way to examine the character. And it can be quite specific sometimes. he's saying, use the rhythm, use the rhythm, use the rhythm. I'm going to go back to a couple let's take two of the most probably quoted lines in Shakespeare, the two that everybody knows. The first is Hamlet. To be or not to be, that is the question. What does the iambic rhythm tell us about that line? To be or not to be, that is the question. Okay, there's the female ending, but we'll live with that. So if you ask yourself, where does the emphasis fall and what does that teach us about the line? What we often hear is to be or not to be, that is the question. To be or not to be, that is the question. But that's almost converting it to prose. If we follow the rhythm, if we follow the iambic rhythm, it offers us a different possibility. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's the correct version. I'm simply saying it offers a possibility to the actor and the audience to look at that question, that very fundamental existential question, in a slightly different way. Where does the iambic fall? To be or not to be? That is the question. Not simply that it is the question, but that it is the specific and possibly ultimate question. To be or not to be? That is the question. That really is the question. There ain't no question like it. That is the question. Of all questions, that is the one. Suddenly you've got a new potential of understanding the line. I'm not saying it's right, because there's no such thing as right in theatre. I am saying that it is as true as any other interpretation, because what we seek as actors and what we should seek as audience is, Pontius Pilate's famous question, what is truth? And what is truth in this is what you can glean from the way the words are structured to feed into you a sense of rhythm and a sense of understanding. Now, there are other directors and actors and teachers who will disagree with me completely. So at this point, let me remind you my frequently referred to dictum, everything I tell you may be wrong. But it is what I believe, it's what I think, and it's how I see it, and how I understand it, and how I think that as an audience, and when you want to go and see Shakespeare, read it first, look at the words, look at the lines, see what you can glean from them, and then listen to the way the actors treat that text, which is what you should do with every play. Juliet has one that's often misquoted or misunderstood. What is Juliet's most famous line while standing on the balcony? Romeo, oh Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Which everybody assumes means, where are you? Which of course it doesn't. But the rhythm teaches us something really fundamental, and what I think is really fascinating. There is a very interesting mix of the rhythms that we've talked about in that line. It starts with dee-dum, dee-dum for two of the feet. It's not Romeo, Romeo, dee-dum, dee-dum. It's dee-dum, dee-dum, Romeo, Romeo. Followed by three more feet in the iambic form. Wherefore art thou Romeo? Wherefore art thou Romeo? Dee-dum, dee-dum. Wherefore art thou? Not wherefore art thou. Wherefore? She's asking why. Where in this stupid world do you have to be Romeo? Of all the people that I could fancy, fall in love with, flirt with, and allow to kiss me in front of the entire family, why does it have to be you? Because you are a Montague. You're the wrong family, you're the wrong person. So that line, it's wherefore, not wherefore. Why? Why? In other words, why do you have to be Romeo? It's the very big question that will eventually bring her to her death. And there she is asking it right at the start of a relationship. And a relationship that's only going to last 5 days, in which they're going to get married, they're going to sleep together, he's going to be banished, and she's going to die, and so is he. Why did you have to be Romeo? That line has such significance to it. If you examine the way it's structured, just the rhythms of it will teach you what that line is saying. So, to sum up, speaking Shakespeare, reading Shakespeare, reading it aloud, which means speaking it, because I don't want you to just sit there looking at the words on the page. I want you to speak it. I want you to enjoy listening to the sound of the words, forming that rhythm, seeing what that rhythm can teach you, playing with the rhythms. Because with Shakespeare, we always say in Shakespeare as actors, there's no subtext. There's nothing going on underneath. What you say is what you think. What you hear people say is what they are thinking. There is duplicity, yes, but that's usually explained in another speech. So what we need you to start, if you want to develop a true understanding of how these plays work and why they're so wonderful, and why this language is so wonderful, you can't read between the lines. You've got to read through them. You've got to actually read through the line. Follow its rhythm. If you find a word confusing, there are plenty of reference books you can go to and say, what does that word mean? But it's much more interesting if you start to find that out for yourself. It's like I say, getting a really complex recipe for something, tasting it as you go, getting used to quantities and things. And very quickly, you'll build up the skill base which you can make that meal. Same with the Shakespeare. You'll find very quickly how you can speak it and what it means to you. I've got some questions. In your opinion, why is Shakespeare so timeless, prolific? What makes him one of the greats? Well, because I think for me, not every play of Shakespeare, some of them are real Lulus. I mean, I'm not a great fan of Timon of Athens. I'm not a huge fan of King John. There are a few of them that I find a little bit heavy going. Cymbeline goes on forever. But by and large, why he, to me, is timeless is because he deals with the human condition. And he was the first great playwright to do that, I think. In that I've said this before, drama to that point, coming all the way down from the Greeks, were based on the principle that the gods were in the heavens, the king was on the throne, and everybody else was a mess. Shakespeare was the first playwright to truly look at the question of king. He couldn't talk about God, because that was illegal, but he could talk about the gods. But his gods became either benign or totally malignant. As flies, the gods are we, they kill us for their sport. But kings, or people in authority, he was the one who first, in a huge sense, turned people in authority into human beings. They did not have divine right. They were not something special. They were human, and in fact, they were more than human. So Shakespeare brought humanity into drama in a way that nobody before him had truly done, and everybody after him followed. That no matter who you were a person. And you were suffering. You were a victim of human frailty. You couldn't escape that. No matter what you sat on, no matter what color the cushion was that you sat on, you were still just a man, just a woman, just a person. Being a king or in authority did not give you some divine right, and rightly so. Shakespeare, in that sense, was the first true Republican. Don't quote me on that. I'm making that up. Lillian, what's your favorite play and why? I am 10 and I love so many of his plays. I'll tell you, my favorite play of Shakespeare, and there are several. I mean, I love Romeo and Juliet. I think it's an exquisite piece of writing it's not a love story. It's about two teenagers who should have known better. It's about two villains who should have known better, the priest and the nurse. It's about Two families who should have known better. It's about every mistake that society can make when it comes to young people. I love Macbeth. I think it's a wonderful adventure yarn, and it's a wonderful character study. But to me, his greatest play has to be King Lear, because King Lear is about the totality of power and majesty realizing its own humanity. It is this, Jan Kot, the Polish commentator, described it as the ultimate tragedy of despair. Just when you think things can't get worse, they do. It's about the human condition. It is a brilliant, brilliant examination. And it's also one of the best journey plays. So many characters in that play are taking a journey that all leads them eventually to the same spot. So I think it's a heavy play, but I do think it's his greatest play. Are there modern playwrights who use iambic? I feel I hear it all through Hamilton. Yes, you do. And there was an English playwright called Christopher Fry who wrote verse drama in the earlier part of the 20th century. There's one of them that I directed years ago. I want to do again at some point, called The Lady's Not for Burning. But yeah, other writers have used iambic because it is a wonderful natural verse form. In fact, I don't know if any of you saw when we did The Lion in Winter about 3 years ago. And The Lion in Winter is written in prose, but if you look at the text very closely, an awful lot of it is actually in iambic pentameter, but just the way the character, the rhythm, and I think it's the way that the author wrote it, the playwright wrote it, because he was hearing something in his head, or maybe he did it deliberately. But yeah, it's not gone away. Eamon, how do actors know how to approach different characters, the way they act or speak? And how do you use Shakespeare's language to show different emotions? Well, I think I've sort of explained that one in the sense that it's all to do with rhythm. It's all to do with understanding how the line is structured. The language will help you demonstrate the emotion. How do actors know how to approach different characters? Rehearsal. Basically, that's what we do. And whether we're doing a play by Shakespeare or a play by Edward Albee or a play by Samuel Beckett or a play by Neil Simon, the same process to an extent applies, in that we will examine the text, we will see what the text offers us in terms of information. We may, if we're playing historical characters, we can do research. But fundamentally, we see what the character is saying. And when we understand what the character is saying, we try from that point to work out why the character is saying it. Now, as I say with Shakespeare, he sort of explains that even as you're speaking the words. But how do we approach different characters? We read the text, basically. Iambic sounds like a heartbeat, which may be why it's so natural to the ear. Yes, it is. It is like a heartbeat. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. That's why you know something's wrong when it goes dee-dum, dee-dum, dee-dum. You know, hang on, irregular heartbeat. What's going on there? So I think, yeah, heartbeat is an extremely good way to describe it. And there you are. The unnatural beat is jarring. It causes you to pay attention. That's why I say it's the ambulance or the cop car sound. Nina, 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 Nina. It's making you sit up and go, what's going on? You know, when somebody says, by the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes, you pay attention. In rehearsal, what's the process of turning iambic rhythm into a grounded performance? That's a very good question. And the answer is, if you've got experienced actors, they sort of do it. But I think it's the fact that once we've discovered what the strict iambic can teach us, like, for instance, to be or not to be, that is the question. To be or not to be, that is the question. Once you've got that thought in your head, it becomes simpler. And when I made up that iambic earlier on in this session about being out on the deck having a beer, that wasn't difficult to make up, because it is the way we speak. Once you become conscious of the intention of the line, it becomes normal to speak. So that, you don't say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? No, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf hath all too short a day. And it's normal. It's the way we speak. So that's the point. It's realizing what the intention of the line is and how the rhythm helps you to understand that, and then saying it. Saying it. Not saying the rhythm, saying the line with the intention. Was there ever a proven identity to the Dark Lady of the Sonnets? Oh, that's Grace. Oh, my love. There have been libraries written on the topic of who is the Dark Lady of the Sonnets, and it could be a boy. But that's a whole, I can probably do 2 more programs on the Dark Lady of the Sonnets, and I'm not going to. But there are plenty of books written about that, plenty of commentaries on it. And look it up on there is a book, I can't remember the name of it now, but if I can find it, I'll put it up on the website. But yeah, there are plenty of thoughts as to who the Dark Lady was. Got another one here. Would different accents affect the rhythm? I've heard it said that English actors are best at performing or speaking Shakespeare because of their accent. Nonsense. Irish actors are the best because of their accent. You can do it in any accent, and especially the old. In fact, the natural dialectics and accents of the New England states, that you will hear in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine and Connecticut and all, you're getting in Massachusetts, particularly in Rhode Island, you are getting closer to the way English might have been spoken in the post-Elizabethan, in the Jacobean times and slightly afterwards. If you listen, what I call the John Gilwood way of speaking Shakespeare, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely and more temperate, is as boring as hell. But if you do that with an East of England accent or a West Country accent, where Shakespeare grew up, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. I mean, you can hear it. It's the texture of the language is so much better. But I can do it in a thick Dublin accent, and it still sounds great. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaves have. You know what I mean? It's not about proper speaking. It's about speaking the words truthfully, understanding the texture of the words, and saying that. So any American can speak Shakespeare exquisitely in his own or her own dialect, so long as they understand the underlying structure of the words and what they represent. Accent or dialect has nothing to do with it. That's why Shakespeare translates so perfectly into almost any culture, because it belongs in any culture. So was that all on that question? I think. That's the other one. How much truth is invested in his histories? We might later in the year, or maybe we get around to it, do a thing about the history plays. The history plays, you don't get to see them very often because they usually have 900 people in the cast, but they're fascinating. What is called the Henriade, which starts basically with King John, but it had a terrible play, but with Richard II, and then going through Henry IV Part 1 and 2, Henry V, Henry VI Part 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. That's the whole Henriade thing. They are based on history, and they are not historical. They are based around that whole period that led to the great English Civil War. When we think of the English Civil War, we think of Oliver Cromwell and all of that. No, the Great Civil War was the War of the Roses. After Richard II and all the way through to Richard III, who was the last of the Plantagenets, and where that struggle was finally brought together by Henry VII, Henry Tudor, marrying Anne of York and bringing the two houses together to create the Tudor Rose of red and white. The plays are based loosely on historical fact, but they are utterly unfactual, is the best way I can describe it. They are dramas. They are not history. That said, they're bloody good plays. They really are good plays. And some of his finest writing is in them. And some of the most moving writing is in them, because he's writing not about history, but again, about the condition of civil war and what it does. And there's a fabulous scene in one of the Henry VI plays. I think it's part 2. Can't remember. But the scene is literally, it says, a father who has killed his son on one side of the stage, and a son who has killed his father on the other side of the stage. And how they talk and how Henry reacts to that is one of the most moving pieces of writing on the topic of civil war. And we can recognize it in this country because it's not that long ago. And we can, any country that has suffered that, and almost every country on the planet has suffered from that notion of father killing son, son killing father, family divided over something that destroys us, destroys them. So yeah, the Henry are, they're not historically accurate, but they're historically wonderful. Did Shakespeare believe 2 double negatives made a positive, or did he like a double superlative? To my mind, to my mind, he just wanted the rhythm to work. This was the most unkindest cut of all. Makes the rhythm work. But I do think he might, I don't know, we never know. But I do think he might have liked that he was using a double superlative, that it was the most best thing. And we all know a double superlative just sounds wrong. Whenever you do it, it sounds wrong. But not when Shakespeare writes it. It seems to sound right. So I think he probably, we'll never know, but I think he probably did enjoy it. How do you feel about cuts or alterations to the text that potentially disrupts the meter? Very good question again, and the answer is, I will, when I edit them, because it's very difficult to do a full-length Shakespeare. I mean, I appeared once in a full-length Romeo and Juliet, and it went on for 5.25 hours. Hamlet goes on for longer than that. So you have to edit them down. And I don't believe that in Shakespeare's time, they necessarily played all of that text. These texts were gathered together and put together by the people who assembled the folio. In fact, Wells and Taylor, for the Oxford edition of Shakespeare, the current Oxford, maintained there were 2 different versions of King Lear. So they call one of them the Tragedy of King Lear and one the History of King Lear. Most of the plays the 2 plays are the same, but there are fundamental differences, and one is shorter than the other. When you cut Shakespeare, when you edit it, it is, I don't think it's imperative, but for myself as a director, I like to fight very hard to maintain the meter. Sometimes in Shakespeare, you'll see a line that's got, 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet, 2 feet, 3 feet empty. He's saying there's a pause there. That's all. So trying to get that meter to work well, I do work very hard to do that. It's not like religious observance. It's just that I think that you serve the audience better, and you serve the actor better. To hell with Shakespeare, he's dead 400 years. But the audience and the actor get served better if you can maintain that rhythmic structure that Shakespeare was striving for. So anyway, that's it. We've run over time as usual. I hope you stuck with me. Next week, we're going to be joined. We've got Shakespeare's Ladies next week. So I will have 4 ladies reading. We'll be slotting them in. We've got Sage Smith and Zoe Abion, who were recently in Midsummer Night's Dream. They played Hermia and Helena and were wonderful. We also have a new young actress to our fold who was to be in the first play of our season, but unfortunately we can't put any plays on at the moment, but you will be seeing a lot of her with PICT and in other places, and that is Alison Svagdis and PICT all-time favorite Karen Baum. They're going to be joining me next week when we look at Shakespeare's Ladies. Do remember, we're only here and we can only keep being here if you send us a donation. Doesn't have to be huge, but please don't forget, every dollar counts, and all that you send us goes to maintain PICT, so that when we are allowed to put plays back on the stage, we'll still be here to do it. So any support you can give us, please, please, please do so. You'll find a donation button on the website, and I think we have donation buttons in various other places. But thank you all for being with me. I'll see you all next week, surrounded by a bevy of beauty. Bless you.